The ground shook that morning, December 16, 1944. Just before dawn broke over the Belgian countryside near Monchaux, and the cold bit deep into every soldier's bones, the kind of cold that makes steel brittle and fingers numb. American artillery shells were screaming overhead, punching through the freezing air with that familiar whistle every combat veteran knows by heart. But something felt wrong, something the German soldiers advancing through the snow couldn't quite understand at first. The explosions weren't hitting the earth like they should have, weren't throwing up fountains of frozen dirt and shattered trees. Instead, they were bursting in midair, 30, 40, maybe 50 feet above the ground. And when they detonated, the sky itself seemed to come apart in a rain of white-hot metal that fell on everything below. The 326th Volksgrenadier Division had pushed through worse than this. They'd survived the Eastern Front, where the Soviets threw everything they had at them, where winter meant death and summer meant dust and blood. These were hardened men who knew every trick of staying alive under fire. But this was different. This was something none of them had ever seen before. You could dig into the frozen earth as deep as your strength allowed. You could press yourself flat behind the thickest tree trunk. You could find a ditch or a crater and pray the next shell missed you. But none of it mattered anymore, because death was coming from above with a precision that felt almost personal. Back at the American artillery positions, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson stood in the cold morning air, knowing he'd just broken every rule in the book. He'd given an order that could end his career, maybe even land him in front of a court-martial. But he'd watched the German assault building, and he knew his men from the 38th Cavalry Squadron were about to be overrun if something didn't change fast. So he'd done the unthinkable. He'd ordered his gunners to load shells equipped with proximity fuses, the most jealously guarded secret the Allies possessed. Technology so revolutionary that standing orders forbade its use on land for fear. The Germans might capture one intact and figure out how it worked. These weren't ordinary fuses. They were miniature radar systems packed into a space no bigger than a coffee can. Electronic brains that could sense when they were close enough to a target and trigger detonation at exactly the right height to maximize the kill zone below. The math was brutal and simple. One proximity-fused shell could do the work of 50 conventional rounds, could turn open ground into a slaughterhouse and forest cover into a trap, could find soldiers wherever they hid and tear them apart with fragments traveling faster than sound. What those German soldiers were experiencing in real time was the future of warfare arriving decades early, delivered by American science and industry working at a scale that would have seemed impossible just years before. Hitler had bet everything on this offensive, his last desperate gamble to turn the tide of a war that everyone knew Germany was losing. He'd assembled 200,000 men, 1,000 tanks, nearly 2,000 artillery pieces, all hidden in the fog and forest of the Ardennes where Allied intelligence swore the Germans couldn't possibly mount a major attack. Operation Watch on the Rhine, they called it. And when it kicked off at 5:30 that morning with 1,600 artillery rounds per minute hammering American positions along an 85-mile front, it caught everyone by surprise, green replacement troops and exhausted veterans alike. Men who'd been sent to this supposedly quiet sector to rest found themselves in the middle of the biggest German offensive on the Western Front since D-Day. But at Monchaux, Colonel Axelson had just changed the equation in a way Hitler's generals couldn't have anticipated in their darkest nightmares. He'd unleashed a weapon that would stop the German advance cold and rewrite the rules of modern combat. The effect was immediate and horrifying. German infantry advancing in their Trident true assault formations, squads moving together with covering fire and mutual support, suddenly found themselves under a type of bombardment that defied everything they'd learned about artillery. The shells were exploding overhead in perfect synchronization, each burst creating a cone of deadly fragments that spread out in all directions. And there was nowhere to hide, no safe position, no tactical solution that centuries of military doctrine could offer. Men who'd survived years of combat, who knew instinctively when to move and when to freeze, when to dig in and when to withdraw, died in their foxholes without ever seeing what killed them. Cut down by steel moving so fast it was invisible until it punched through flesh and bone. The veterans from the Eastern Front, the ones who'd thought they'd seen every horror war could offer, broke and ran. And you couldn't blame them because this wasn't warfare as they understood it. This was something new and terrible that seemed to defy the laws of nature itself. The proximity fuse represented everything America did best, the marriage of pure scientific genius with industrial power on a scale no other nation could match. And the story of how it came to be reads like something out of science fiction. Inside each fuse, American engineers had managed to pack 130 electronic components, including 4 or 5 vacuum tubes, depending on the model. The same kind of tubes you'd find in a living room radio, but redesigned from the ground up to survive forces that would crush a human body to paste. When an artillery shell fires, the acceleration reaches 20,000 times Earth's gravity, enough force to shatter glass and pulverize bone. And the temperature inside the gun barrel spikes to 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit for a fraction of a second, before the shell screams out into freezing air that can drop below zero at altitude. Somehow, impossibly, these delicate electronic components had to survive all of that, and then function perfectly while spinning at speeds that create massive centrifugal forces, all to deliver one precise moment of detonation at exactly the right height to kill as many enemy soldiers as possible. Dr. Merle Tuve, at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory had driven this program with an intensity that matched the Manhattan Project. Working out of a building disguised as an abandoned car dealership in Silver Spring, Maryland, where 3% of all American physicists were employed at peak production. The security was airtight. Workers couldn't talk about what they were building even to their own families. Every fuse carried a unique serial number for tracking, and the penalty for leaking information was severe enough that nobody tested it. The technical challenge seemed impossible at first. How do you take vacuum tubes designed to sit safely in someone's living room and make them work inside an artillery shell? But the breakthrough came through miniaturization techniques that would later revolutionize the entire electronics industry. Dr. James Van Allen created tubes no larger than pencil erasers that contained all the elements of full-sized radio tubes. And by December 1944, American factories were stamping out 40,000 proximity fuses every single day. Over 100 companies from RCA and General Electric to Sylvania and Crossley Corporation, all contributing pieces of the puzzle. The program cost $1 billion in 1940s money, second only to the atomic bomb in wartime spending. And it was worth every penny because it turned American artillery from a support weapon into a war instrument of destruction. Colonel Axelson's unauthorized decision on December 16th created an immediate crisis up the chain of command. He'd violated direct orders that restricted proximity fuses to anti-aircraft use only because the brass was terrified that if the Germans captured even one intact shell, they might reverse-engineer the technology and deploy it themselves. But the results at Monchaux were undeniable. The German attack had been stopped dead with casualties that shocked both sides, and word of the weapon's devastating effectiveness reached Supreme Headquarters within hours. General Eisenhower, watching reports come in of German forces smashing through American lines all across the Ardennes, recognized desperation. When he saw it and formally requested authorization to use proximity fuses in ground combat on December 19th, by December 20th, all restrictions were lifted and proximity-fused shells were being shipped to artillery units across the entire battlefield. And the speed of that distribution demonstrated American logistical superiority in a way nothing else could. Within days, every major artillery unit had access to the new ammunition. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion trapped in Bastogne received their allocation just as the German ring closed around the town. The 420 Armored Field Artillery Battalion, with their MCVN Priest, self-propelled howitzers started using them to defend the northwest approaches. And the 916 9th Artillery Battalion, an African-American unit commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Hubert D. Barnes, employed them with devastating effect southwest of Bastogne. Every unit that got their hands on proximity fuses discovered the same truth. It transformed artillery from something that required careful adjustment and forward, observers calling in corrections, to something that just worked. The fuses would find their own optimal detonation point automatically. Accuracy requirements dropped, while lethality increased by factors that seemed impossible. And suddenly artillery could be effective even in poor weather and darkness when forward observers couldn't see anything at all. The siege of Bastogne became the perfect demonstration of what proximity fuses could do in defensive warfare. The 101st Airborne Division, completely surrounded and outnumbered, holding the vital crossroads against repeated German assaults that should have overwhelmed them. Their artillery support included the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion with 75mm pack howitzers that could fire proximity-fused shells. And between December 19th and 31st, they fired exactly 7,676 rounds according to official unit records. Not all of them were proximity-fused because supply was still limited. But the ones that were had effects that went beyond just physical destruction. They broke German morale in ways conventional artillery never could. German assault formations would advance across snow-covered fields in textbook formations that had worked for generations. And then proximity-fused shells would detonate overhead with perfect timing, and entire platoons would simply cease to exist, just gone in seconds with overlapping patterns of destruction that left no safe zones whatsoever. The December 22nd attack that came after General McAuliffe's famous nuts reply to the German surrender demand showcased the weapon at peak effectiveness. German infantry caught in the open under airburst barrages that seemed to possess intelligence, that seemed to know exactly where they were and exactly when to detonate for maximum carnage. The all-African-American 969th Artillery Battalion played an equally crucial role with their 155mm howitzers, creating a ring of death around Bastogne's perimeter that German forces simply could not penetrate. The larger shells, detonating at 50 feet, covered even greater areas with lethal fragments. And German prisoners later reported that attacking units often lost cohesion before they even reached American lines. Soldiers fleeing the incomprehensible airbursts in blind panic. Perhaps the most thoroughly documented demonstration of proximity fuse lethality occurred at the Sauer River near Turnach. On Christmas Day into the 26th, General George S. Patton himself witnessed this engagement and recorded it in his memoir, War as I Knew It. And his account is chilling in its precision. A German battalion was attempting to cross the partially frozen river under cover of darkness and fog. They believed they were hidden from American observers, and that traditional artillery would require careful adjustment of fire, giving them time to complete the crossing or find cover. But proximity-fused, shells needed no such adjustment. They just needed to be pointed in the general direction, and they'd do the rest. Patton wrote that they caught the German battalion in the middle of the crossing, and the new fuse ammunition was devastating. The shells burst in the air above them, and the Germans had absolutely nowhere to run. The river behind them, American fire in front and above, a perfect killing box. When the firing stopped, American troops counted 702 bodies, an exact figure that represents one of the few precisely documented casualty counts from proximity fuse employment. And the mathematical efficiency was stark and brutal. An entire battalion essentially ceased to exist in minutes with no possibility of escape or defense. The psychological impact spread throughout German units in the sector like wildfire. Soldiers started refusing orders to conduct river crossings because they'd heard what happened to the battalion at the Sauer. And that kind of breakdown in military discipline is worth more than any body count. The Ardennes dense forests that the Germans had, counted on for concealment, became death traps once proximity fuses entered the equation. And the physics of why made perfect sense once you understood it. In open terrain, a proximity fuse detonating at 30 to 50 feet was deadly enough, covering a wide area with fragments. But in forests, the effects multiplied exponentially because the airbursts would shatter tree branches and create thousands of additional wooden projectiles. These splinters, some as long as a man's arm, traveled at hundreds of feet per second with lethal force. And traditional defensive positions that had worked for centuries suddenly became worthless. Taking cover behind large trees meant nothing because the fragments came from above. Digging foxholes under root systems provided no protection against death raining down from the canopy. And American artillery units quickly recognized this force multiplier and exploited it ruthlessly. A single proximity-fused 155mm shell detonating above the forest canopy could clear an area the size of a tennis court of all living things. The combination of metal fragments from the shell and wooden splinters from the trees, creating a 360-degree kill zone that no amount of tactical skill or combat experience could help you evade. German units trained specifically in forest warfare. Men who knew every trick of using trees for cover and concealment. found their expertise utterly worthless against this new threat. Spreading out to avoid concentrated casualties made units vulnerable to the wide area effects. Bunching together for mutual support meant entire squads could be eliminated by single shells. There was simply no correct tactical response, and the Germans knew it. The proximity fuse operated on principles that seemed like pure science fiction to soldiers in 19. Each fuse contained a tiny radio transmitter operating at frequencies between 180 and 220 megahertz, continuously sending out electromagnetic waves that reflected off anything solid: ground, trees, vehicles, human bodies. As the shell approached its target, the reflected signal would strengthen, and when it reached a predetermined intensity, corresponding to optimal burst height, an electronic switch would trigger detonation, the entire system functioning under conditions that would destroy any normal electronics. The shells spun at rates, creating massive centrifugal forces. Temperatures ranged from the gun barrel's 3,000-degree heat to sub-zero cold at trajectory peak. Yet these delicate vacuum tubes, protected by innovative cushioning systems, survived and functioned with over 80% reliability, which was remarkable considering what they had to endure. The optimal burst heights had been determined through extensive testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground. For 105mm howitzers, which were the standard divisional artillery piece, 30 feet, proved ideal. The 155mm guns achieved maximum lethality at 50 feet, and the rare 240mm shells created devastating effects at 70+ feet, capable of clearing entire grid squares of enemy forces. This technological superiority translated directly into battlefield dominance in ways that were measurable and undeniable. Studies showed proximity fuses increased lethality by 5 to 10 times over conventional shells, and the lethal fragment area increased by a factor of 50. Those aren't estimates or propaganda. Those are cold, hard numbers based on actual battlefield results. The German intelligence failure regarding proximity fuses proved catastrophic in ways that are almost hard to believe. In December 1944, Wehrmacht forces overran an American ammunition depot and captured approximately 20,000 proximity-fused shells, an intelligence windfall that should have immediately led to countermeasure development, or at minimum, understanding of what they were facing. Instead, German technical experts examined the captured fuses and declared them impossible. The presence of vacuum tubes in an artillery shell contradicted everything German engineers believed about electronics and ballistics. They concluded the Americans must be using some form of magnetic detection, or that the visible components were decoys hiding the real mechanism. This failure stemmed partly from institutional blindness because Germany had actually led proximity fuse development before the war. Rheinmetall Borsig and AEG Berlin had working prototypes by 1940, but Hitler's order, canceling all weapons projects requiring more than 6 months to production, had terminated the program. German engineers couldn't accept that the Americans had solved problems they themselves had abandoned as too difficult. The irony deepened when you consider that German electrostatic proximity fuses showed 95% reliability in tests using electrical capacitance changes rather than radar. As development continued, Germany might have fielded proximity fuses by 1941, and the entire war might have gone differently. Hermann Göring would later admit during interrogation that German fuses were 3 or 4 months from production when the war ended. 3 or 4 months, that might as well have been 3 or 4 years, given how fast things were moving by then. December 25, 1944, brought no holiday respite. German units attempting to use Christmas for resupply and reorganization discovered that proximity fuses recognized no ceasefires and showed no mercy. Field kitchens, supply convoys, assembly areas, all came under devastating bombardment that required no forward observers to direct fire. The 420 Armored Field Artillery Battalion alone fired over 1,000 rounds on Christmas Day, with most of them their MC Van Priest self-propelled howitzers delivering rapid, accurate fire that caught German units completely unprepared. The ability to fire effectively without observation in poor weather and during darkness transformed artillery from primarily a daylight weapon into a 24-hour threat, and the psychological impact on German soldiers was severe and immediate. They'd learned to move during poor weather when Allied aircraft couldn't fly and observers couldn't spot them. That had been the one time they felt relatively safe. But proximity fuses eliminated that sanctuary completely. Death could arrive at any moment, in any weather, with no warning beyond the brief whistle of incoming shells, and then the airburst, and then nothing. On December 21st, SS Colonel Otto Skorzeny's elite commandos attempted to capture Malmedy, and these weren't ordinary soldiers by any stretch. These were specially selected troops who'd rescued Mussolini from a mountaintop prison, nearly captured Tito in Yugoslavia, infiltrated American lines wearing U.S. uniforms and speaking English. They represented the absolute best Germany could field in terms of training and fanaticism. They met devastating proximity-fused artillery fire that transformed their American disguises from tactical advantage into death shrouds. The shells exploded overhead with uncanny precision, as if they could somehow detect the impostors below, which of course they couldn't, but it sure felt that way to the men dying under them. While exact casualty figures remain disputed to this day, the attack failed catastrophically with heavy losses that ended Skorzeny's offensive operations for the remainder of the battle. And the psychological breakdown among elite SS troops proved particularly significant. These were soldiers indoctrinated with beliefs in German superiority and trained to the highest standards the Third Reich could manage. Fanatics who believed they were invincible, and they found themselves completely helpless against American technology. Some survivors reportedly charged directly toward American lines, preferring quick death in close combat to continued bombardment from above. A complete breakdown of military discipline among Hitler's most dedicated troops. The production miracle behind proximity fuses matched any wartime industrial achievement America pulled off, and there were many to choose from. By December 1944, over 100 American companies had converted to fuse production. The Crossley Corporation abandoned refrigerator manufacturing to assemble fuses. Emerson Radio retooled from home electronics to weapons production. Sylvania and RCA and General Electric dedicated entire facilities to the program, and the quality control exceeded anything previously attempted in mass production. Each of the 130 components underwent individual testing. Every solder joint was inspected under magnification. Random samples were actually fired from artillery pieces to ensure they'd survive under combat conditions. And the rejection rate was ruthless, with any component showing the slightest deviation being discarded immediately. The workforce was predominantly women, working 12-hour shifts 6 days a week, maintaining precision that would have impressed Swiss watchmakers. And they couldn't know what they were making due to security compartment. They only knew it was vital to the war effort, and that was enough. By December 1944, they were producing one proximity fuse every 2 seconds around the clock, and the cost reduction achieved through mass production was remarkable. In 1942, each fuse cost $732, which was more than a worker's annual salary. By December 1944, mass production had driven costs down to $18 per unit, while actually improving quality. This efficiency allowed the production of 22 million fuses during the war, with 200,000 deployed during the Battle of the Bulge alone, numbers that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. General Patton understood proximity fuses value better than perhaps any commander in the European theater. His Third Army, driving north to relieve Bastogne, used them as a breakthrough weapon rather than just defensive support. His artillery commander, Brigadier General Edward Williams, developed new tactics specifically for proximity fuse employment, pioneering the time-on-target concentration. Using proximity fuses where multiple battalions would fire simultaneously so all their shells arrived at the same instant. When dozens of proximity-fused shells detonated simultaneously at optimal height, the effect was apocalyptic. German soldiers called it the bell toll of death, and they weren't being poetic. It really did sound like enormous bells ringing as the airbursts overlapped, creating pressure waves that could rupture eardrums and collapse lungs even if the fragments missed you. In the week between December 22nd and 29th, Patton's Third Army fired 50,000 proximity-fused shells, and the results were decisive in breaking German resistance and opening the corridor to Bastogne. Patton himself wrote that the funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. And while that might be an overstatement, it wasn't much of one. The Battle of Elsenborn Ridge demonstrated proximity fuses at maximum effectiveness in a defensive stand that deserves to be better remembered. Here, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held critical high ground against the 6th SS Panzer Army, including the elite 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, some of the most fanatical and experienced troops Germany had left. Over 3 days, from December 17th to 19th, American artillery fired 160,000 rounds, with approximately 40,000 being proximity. These 25% of shells accounted for an estimated 60% of the 5,000-plus German casualties, and the mathematics were undeniable. Proximity fuses multiplied American firepower by a factor of 4. The German attacks, launched repeatedly up the steep forested slopes, met walls of airburst steel that seemed impossible to penetrate. Entire companies disappeared in seconds, bodies piled so thick that subsequent waves had to literally climb over their own dead to continue the advance. And after 3 days, the attacks simply ceased. The elite of the Waffen SS had been broken by American technology. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, 900 fighters attacking Allied airfields in a last desperate gamble. And the surprise was complete, with many Allied aircraft caught on the ground and destroyed. But returning German pilots met walls of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire, and the slaughter was terrible. Of 277 German aircraft lost that day, 172 fell to anti-aircraft guns, with most using proximity fuses, and the kill rate stunned both sides. German pilots trained to evade predictive anti-aircraft fire through evasive maneuvering found shells detonating precisely where they would cause maximum damage no matter what they did, and the Luftwaffe, already crippled by fuel shortages and losses of experience, pilots never recovered from this single day's catastrophe. By early January 1945, maintaining secrecy around proximity fuses became impossible. Too many shells had been fired. Too many soldiers on both sides had witnessed their effects. Too many rumors were spreading through the ranks. On January 6th, the War Department authorized limited disclosure, and the New York Times reported on a new type of artillery shell that multiplies the effectiveness of American guns without explaining the actual technology involved. And German intelligence finally grasped the weapon's true significance, but far too late to matter. A January 10th report from foreign armies West stated that the Americans possess a radio-controlled artillery fuse that detonates shells at optimal height for anti-personnel effect. This weapon has caused severe casualties among our forces. In the Ardennes, no effective countermeasures exist, which was about as close to an admission of complete tactical defeat as German military reports ever came. Post-war analysis revealed proximity fuses decisive impact in ways that are hard to overstate. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who commanded the entire offensive, stated that the proximity fuse was decisive. Our attacks broke down not because of American courage, though they fought well, but because of artillery that seemed to have eyes. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded 5th Panzer Army, testified that American artillery was the terror of our soldiers, especially the new shells that exploded in the air. They caused panic even among veteran troops, and these weren't men given to exaggeration or excuse-making. The statistics tell the story in stark terms. 200,000 proximity-fused shells fired, accounting for an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 German casualties. Up to 20% of total German losses in the entire battle, and the weapon achieved 5 to 10 times greater effectiveness than conventional ammunition. While requiring no forward observation in poor weather, behind every statistic lay human tragedy that's easy to forget when you're talking about numbers and percentages. German soldiers, many of them teenagers, conscripted in the war's final desperate stages, died in ways that traditional warfare had never contemplated, killed by weapons that seemed to possess intelligence that could find them wherever they hid. American production workers paid their own price, though it's rarely discussed. Factory accidents were hushed up for security reasons. Workers at Crosley Corporation and Emerson Radio and other facilities suffered breakdowns from stress and exhaustion. They produced weapons of unprecedented lethality without knowing what they were making, and carried that burden in enforced silence. Yet the moral calculation of war is never simple and never clean. The Battle of the Bulge cost 19,000 American lives. Without proximity fuses, how many more would have died? How much longer would the war have lasted? How many more Holocaust victims would have perished in camps while battles raged on? Every day, the war was shortened, potentially saved thousands of people, awaiting liberation in concentration camps. And that's a calculation worth considering, even if it provides no easy answers. The proximity fuse program generated advances that transformed post-war technology in ways most people don't realize. The miniaturized vacuum tubes became foundations for modern electronics. Quality control procedures established for fuse production became industry standards that are still used today. The organizational methods coordinating hundreds of suppliers pioneered modern supply chain management that companies like Walmart and Amazon now use. Dr. James Van Allen applied his miniaturization expertise to satellite instrumentation and later discovered Earth's radiation belts that now bear his name. The radar principles evolved into modern systems used in everything from air traffic control to police speed guns, and the concept of autonomous sensors making split-second decisions became the foundation for guided missiles and eventually all smart weapons. Every precision-guided munition used today, from Tomahawk cruise missiles to JDAM bombs, descends directly from the proximity fuse, the first weapon that could sense its environment and choose when to detonate, the first true smart weapon in human history. The revolution that began in the Ardennes continues on modern battlefields where smart weapons dominate warfare in ways that would have seemed like pure fantasy to soldiers in 1940-4. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended January 20, 1945, with German forces in full retreat, having lost approximately 100,000 casualties while achieving absolutely nothing. American losses totaled 75,000, including 19,000 killed, and the proximity fuse had proven itself not just as a weapon, but as a war winner that changed the fundamental calculus of modern combat. General Eisenhower's post-war assessment that German possession of proximity fuses might have made D-Day exceedingly difficult, perhaps impossible, underscores their strategic importance. They weren't merely an artillery improvement, but a revolutionary technology that fundamentally changed warfare's mathematics. The German soldiers who faced proximity-fused artillery in those frozen forests experienced something unprecedented in military history. Death delivered by shells that seemed intelligent, that could find them anywhere they hid, that transformed the very air itself into a killing zone from which there was no escape. Their experience marked warfare's transformation into the technological age, where scientific innovation and industrial capacity matter as much as courage and tactics. From Colonel Axelson's unauthorized first use on December 16, 1944, through the systematic deployment of 200,000 shells across the Ardennes, proximity fuses demonstrated that scientific innovation could provide decisive military advantage. The convergence of American industrial capacity and scientific genius and tactical adaptation created a weapon that helped determine not just this battle's outcome, but the war's ultimate conclusion. And the proximity fuse story is ultimately about transformation, technological and tactical and human, proving that industrial democracy could produce weapons of devastating effectiveness, that innovation could overcome numerical disadvantage, that the side with superior science would likely prevail in modern warfare. These lessons shaped not just World War II's remainder, but the entire structure of warfare that followed and continues to this day. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the age of technological warfare truly arrived, where the mathematics of death were rewritten by tiny radar sets packed into artillery shells, forever changing how humans wage war and how battles are won and lost. The German soldiers who died beneath proximity-fused airbursts were casualties, not just of one particular battle in one particular war, but of a revolution in military affairs that continue shaping conflicts around our world today. And their deaths marked the moment when warfare stopped being primarily about courage and tactics and became increasingly about technology and science and industrial capacity, a transformation that defines modern combat and shows no signs of reversing. The echoes of those airbursts still whisper through military doctrine and weapons development, still shape how nations prepare for war, still remind us that in the end, the side with better science and greater industrial power will likely prevail, no matter how brave or skilled their opponents might be. And that's a lesson written in the snow and blood of the Ardennes, that December when the future of warfare arrived decades ahead of schedule.